Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Turning the Tide for 2016, Unemployment Insurance Eligibility Expansions that Support Working Families, hosted by the National Employment Law Project, also known as NEL. My name is Rebecca Dixon. I'm a Senior Staff Attorney and Acting Deputy Program Director at NEL. I'll be your moderator for today, and I'll also be your first presenter. We're excited to have so many of you on to join us today. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's event. This webinar is scheduled to last for 1 hour. With the worst of this crisis past us in the economy, the purpose of this webinar is to take the green shoots of positive change that we saw in 2015 in unemployment insurance legislation and grow them in 2016. In particular, we'll speak to reforms of part-time and partial benefits and expansions of compelling family circumstances rules that can better assist working families. We'll be sharing a PowerPoint presentation covering recent legislative developments and introducing the new 2015 edition of NELP's UI Policy Advocates Toolkit. You'll also hear about DC's UI reform campaign. In order to leave ample time to get your questions answered, we'll do the question period at the end, after all the presenters have spoken. To minimize background noise, all the lines have been muted except for those of the panelists. If you're listening through a computer and you have issues with your audio quality, please use the call-in number. That number is 1-877-219-3817, and you'll need to put in conference ID 733-19236. And I'll broadcast that information later in the webinar in case you need it. Please note, there may be a slight delay as the slides advance during the presentation. We will also be sending out a copy of the PowerPoint via email after the webinar, and there'll be included a link to a recording of the webinar as well. Please type your questions in the question box at any time during the presentation, and I'll collect those questions and direct them to the appropriate panelists at the end. We're going to try and answer as many questions as we can in the time allotted. I'm going to be your first panelist, and I'll provide you with an overview of the legislative UI trends, including some positive developments that we saw in 2015. Next, you're going to hear from Drake Hagner. She's a staff attorney with the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia. She will recount her experience working with the DC Coalition on legislation that is currently pending to make significant benefit improvements to their program. And our last speaker will be Senior NELP Staff Attorney Rick McHugh. Rick will present the new edition of the UI Policy Advocates Toolkit and some other valuable resources. So here's an overview of what we'll cover. First, we'll take on the state UI programs and tell you about what's been going on there. Next, we'll talk about the trends that we've seen in the state. And then you'll hear from Drake. She'll tell you about the District of Columbia's campaign. And then Rick will tell you about the policy toolkit and cover some resources that'll be really helpful. And then we'll have a question and answer period and some discussion. There are a lot of numbers on this slide, but the main takeaway from this slide is really how well the UI program rose to the challenge of the recession. Not only did the federal government expand the UI program, but states did as well through the UI modernization program that was part of the Recovery Act. So millions of workers were kept out of poverty and kept in the labor market during the recession by the UI program. In fact, at its peak in 2010, 7 out of 10 workers were receiving regular or federal UI benefits. Between 2008 and 2013, 24.5 million long-term unemployed workers received $230 billion emergency unemployment insurance compensation and extended benefit dollars. And here's another slide that shows you the impact of all these benefits on UI trust funds during the recession. An important thing to note is that heading into the recession, the trust funds were really unprepared for even a modest recession. So the benefits, the payout of benefits was one impact, but just not being prepared for the recession was another impact. So the trust funds borrowed. They borrowed heavily, and that's one of the big takeaways from this slide. You can see the number for, if you look at 2014, at the end, 18 states had roughly still $14 billion in outstanding loans. And the borrowing was really unprecedented in this recession. And so you can see the high demand was one factor, but really the policy choices that leading up to the recession of not putting money in for the rainy day like states are supposed to was really also a big factor. So you can see the crisis of not saving enough in the trust really had a devastating effect on the state program. Starting in 2011, 8 states cut the basic 26 weeks of benefits in the UI program, which had been a national standard for 50 years. So you can see Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kansas, Michigan, Missouri, North Carolina, and South Carolina made cuts to their program. And then Illinois, but only for 1 week in 2012. And then Rhode Island made changes to their benefit program, which changed the weeks that were paid in a single year. And inside of this number of weeks, you don't see that North Carolina also cut their weekly amount that they paid from $525 down to $350 a week. We also had several states that cut the amount that they paid by changing their benefit formulas. And then you see here Rhode Island, Indiana, and Pennsylvania made changes by changing the benefits to less than 26 weeks by changing the benefit formula. And then of these 8 that cut weeks, Arkansas and Missouri came back in 2015 and cut the weeks even further. The weeks, the cuts ranged from just cutting off a whole 6 weeks in the case of South Carolina, Missouri, and Michigan, or changing to a sliding scale based on the unemployment rate in the other states that you see there. And you could see that there is some conflicts going on in Missouri in terms of whether or not that cut will stand. The governor vetoed the cut, and that veto is now there's an issue with that in the courts right now. And you can see that Ohio is looking at a sliding scale in a bill for 2016. So the impact of all of this has really affected the national average of recipiency benefits for workers. You can see that these policy choices that states are making, they're not only cutting weeks, but they're also tightening eligibility standards, has driven the recipiency rate down to a record low in 2014. So this slide just kind of sums up what we just went through. The length and depth of the recession really did expose the underfinancing of state UI programs. Their borrowing and tax increases set the stage for benefit cuts and eligibility restrictions, and the permanent cuts that states made to weeks and the amount have contributed to record low recipiency rates. So the situations that they encountered were temporary, but they made permanent cuts to the program. Another challenge that states are facing is that the infrastructure in their UI programs is all computers and phones, and all of that infrastructure is old. The federal funding that they get for this infrastructure hasn't kept pace with the needs, and the recession also exposed the fact that this infrastructure was in a state of disrepair. And we've seen that states, even when they got new IT systems, this wasn't done well, and there was just a disaster with beneficiaries having a really hard time getting through on the phones or even through the computer systems to get benefits. And we're also seeing that fraud is being used as a tool in some states against the program. So there's some new guidances that were recently released by the Department of Labor on this issue, and NELP has a webinar that's coming up on December 2nd that'll give you a lot more information on the guidances and on this issue, and we'll be sending out an invite and more information on that, so be on the lookout for that. So all of that bad information, but this year in 2015, we did see some good things happen. We saw some green shoots of positive change, and that's going to be where what the rest of the webinar will be about. So less of the gloom and doom. So hopefully the crisis is over. We've turned a corner. The economy is starting to come back. And we saw in Alabama, they significantly improved their partial unemployment insurance benefit. So that benefit had been, so partial unemployment insurance is where you can receive unemployment insurance if you're unemployed and you take a part-time job up to a certain level of part-time work, or if you're partially unemployed, so you're working but your hours are reduced to a certain degree. And in Alabama, they had one of the lowest disregards. So if you were unemployed in Alabama and you went to work part-time, you could only earn $15 and still receive your unemployment check, which was a very big disincentive for anyone to take a part-time job while they were unemployed. And we know that it's very important for people to get back in the workforce to prevent becoming long-term employed. We learned that in this most recent recession. And so Alabama changed their disregard to 1/3 of your weekly benefit amount, which is a huge increase, which is very good for workers. And we had 3 states that made changes to their domestic violence law, which is part of the package of compelling family reasons. The other 2 pieces of compelling family reasons are needing to leave work to take care of a sick family member and needing to follow a trailing spouse. And so although this is just one piece of compelling family reasons, it is a green shoot, and we do see this as a positive development where states are starting to make positive changes to their laws on this other side of the recession. So I'm going to turn it over to Drake now, who's going to tell you about a reform package that they've been working on in the District of Columbia. And one of the pieces that they're working on, they have lots of great pieces in there, including increasing the maximum weekly benefit. But one of the things they're working on that NELP is working on in this package for working families is trying to increase benefits for part-time workers, and that's in their package as well. And Drake is going to tell you more about that.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. This is Drake Hagner, staff attorney from the Legal Aid Society for DC. And like Rebecca said, we have a bill pending in the DC Council. This has not even moved to a hearing yet, so while we have put in a lot of footwork over the last year, it is far from final, but we're really encouraged by the progress we've been able to make working with the Council so far. So I'm here to just give you a little bit of a snapshot of what's been going on. So this first slide, we're really talking about the need in the District of Columbia, and I'm sure this will mirror some of your states or jurisdictions. One thing that is kind of unique about DC, even though we're a large metropolitan area, we have very high cost of living, our maximum weekly benefit amount from our statute is very, very low. It's only $359 a week, which is much lower than Maryland, which is $430 a week, or Virginia, which is $378. So really, and this is much too low for unemployed claimants who lost a job in the District of Columbia, and we really felt that it needed to change. The problem was, the last benefit increase was in 2005, and any efforts that we had been making in these last 10 years to try and increase that benefit amount had really been thwarted pretty effectively by the employer's lobby, partly because I'm sure part of this is true in many of your states as well, but with DC being such a small geographic region, the threat for a business to be able to switch jurisdictions and really take their business out of DC and move it to Virginia where the tax rate is lower, that's a very viable threat. So it was very difficult getting together the political will to increase this benefit until now. It certainly was not possible during the recession. Another kind of political challenge for this kind of a campaign is, of course, that many people who are later going to become unemployed don't identify themselves as someone who might be impacted by unemployment benefit statutes. While they have a job, people aren't thinking about the fact that they might be losing a job. So unless you're in a recessionary period where people are really, you're amassing groups of people who have been unemployed for a very long period of time, it's also difficult to get people to visit their council members and tell their stories. So that's definitely something we've been working on, but is even a challenge for us now. So without the regular indexing of maximum benefits, just regular increases every year or every few years through our statute, we really had to keep going through this political process over and over again, and it's been hard to make that successful. And finally, another area where this bill is so important is that unemployment just continues to devastate our lowest income neighbors in DC. And I'm sure that's true in your areas as well. So every time that we were looking at one of the provisions for our bill, we really did try to keep the most vulnerable workers in mind, looking at people who have either inconsistent work history or very low wages. How can we really improve access to unemployment benefits and unemployment benefit amounts, for those workers particularly? So the group of people who were getting together to work on this, we decided to pull together as diverse a coalition as we could. So there's some lawyers and advocates from legal service organizations, just traditional legal aid groups. We have some advocates from the AFL-CIO and other unions, which are really important, especially for being able to get a lot of influence at the DC Council. We have workers' rights organizations that represent workers themselves and also workers' rights advocacy issues more broadly. And we also reached out and got a lot of help from policy organizations. We have a local policy and budget analysis organization that's writing our white paper, which is fantastic. We reached out to NELP, who gave us a lot of help with some of the data and research behind the different proposals that we were considering. So everyone brought something to the table. And we began meeting about a year ago and just have kept the momentum going. The next thing we did was we really tried to leverage the existing support for workers' rights issues that's currently happening at the DC Council. So part of our DC landscape is that we do have one of the most progressive councils on workers' rights issues than we've had in probably decades. So the last couple of years we've seen this really exciting change in attitudes towards workers' rights legislation. We've been able to expand our paid sick leave bill, which is also paid safe leave for victims of domestic violence who need time off work to go to court or seek medical treatment. We've been able to strengthen wage theft laws. Minimum wage bills have been right on the table, right in the discussion. So there have been council members who've come to the table fresh from support from their constituents on these issues. So we already had identified council members who were particularly sympathetic and wanted to champion these issues even further when they saw how that helped them in one of the last elections. So that was certainly very helpful. And I already mentioned the white paper. We're going to be combining client stories with also the policy and the budget analysis as just kind of a succinct tool for us to then go speak with council members, speak with the Chamber of Commerce, go to community meetings, et cetera, once things start moving even further along toward getting a hearing. So in my last slide, we'll just be running through the 4 key changes for our bill. I'll say from the get-go, this bill was introduced in September by one of our council members. What was really exciting for us and really quite surprising is we knew it would be introduced and we knew it would have support from at least 1 or 2 council members, but the majority of the council members on the DC Council co-introduced the bill, not just co-sponsored it, but co-introduced it. So certainly that's a very strong sign of support, and we were very encouraged by that. Of course, we still have to get a hearing. We have to work our way through the hearing process. There's plenty of politics left, and there's plenty of maneuvering left, but we did feel encouraged. So here's the 4 main areas that we addressed in the bill. The first was to raise the maximum weekly benefit amount from the current $359 a week to $430 a week. So that would put us in line with Maryland, and that would make us 20th amongst the states and DC, 20th out of 51. Secondly, we did want to improve that partial unemployment benefit formula that Rebecca was talking about earlier, and that's really where we were working closely with NELP to see what are other states proposing, what do these figures mean for claimants on the ground, helping us run the numbers. And so as a way to make it as low-wage worker-friendly as possible, we really prioritized there's 2 parts of the DC formula. The first is kind of an automatic disregard, just a standard dollar amount so that claimants can keep the first $20 of their weekly benefits no matter what they're earning. The second is that 80% of their wages are then subtracted from unemployment. So what we did was we tried to make that $20 disregard, that first disregard, as generous as possible. So even if someone was working a smaller part-time job, fewer hours, or a much lower hourly rate, that they'd be able to keep as much money as possible. So we raised that $20 to $50, and we took the 80% subtraction and we made it 66%. And though a change between 80% and 66% doesn't sound very generous, when we started to run the numbers, it actually was just the sweet spot in between making unemployment benefits a windfall, where people who were working part-time could really receive quite a lot more than they would be getting in their unemployment benefits while working, which we didn't feel was politically viable. In between that and penalizing them or creating some sort of disincentive where what they were receiving in unemployment really wasn't enough to encourage them to go out into the workforce and get that part-time job. So we tried to really get that sweet spot and also encourage or benefit low-wage workers as much as possible. This third bullet point about standardizing the number of unemployment weeks, this is actually a part of the DC statute that's pretty helpful for us. We actually have a pretty fair unemployment statute about how the base wages are calculated, but this is just something that will affect only a very small number of workers, where if someone has kind of an inconsistent work history, they will not have the lesser of their base period wages reduce the number of weeks where they can get unemployment. So everyone will get the full 26 or be eligible for the full 26 weeks of benefits here, even if they've had an inconsistent work history. So the thing that makes DC statute so fair is that we have the quarters where in your base period wages, we don't require workers to have wages in all of those quarters, and they average out over the 26 weeks. So we don't overly penalize people except for this one small issue where sometimes people get less than the full 26 weeks. We don't actually reduce the amount of the weekly benefit amount based on having less in other quarters. So I'm happy to answer more questions about that. Hope I didn't totally mangle that description. And finally, what's most important for the political side and for us as advocates, we really needed to have something in the statute that was implementing an automatic benefit increase for future years. So we don't have to keep bringing this coalition together every couple of years to have just what's simply a fair benefit increase. So we're hoping that that part will pass as well. There were some changes that we were advocating to our partners on the DC Council that did not make it into the bill. We were hoping to have an even more generous formula for wage replacements for low-wage workers. For example, right now it's 1 out of every 26. We wanted it to be 1 out of every 21 so that low-wage workers would be getting slightly more than half of their past wages replaced with unemployment benefits. There wasn't quite enough precedent in the other states, and there just wasn't the political support to really make that into the bill. That's something that I think we'll still be able to raise at hearing, but it's probably not too likely that it'll make it into the final bill. So I'll turn it back to Rebecca. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Drake. That's very, very informative, and I'm sure you'll have some questions in the question and answer period. Next, we're going to hear from Rick. Take it away, Rick.
Thanks, Rebecca. And, certainly, Drake, if you get this through, you'll be the first state to do indexing of your maximum for many years. And I think you'll be the first state to go to uniform duration for at least three decades, if not longer than that. So I know that you feel like things got left out that you would like to have included, but it's a very good package, and we wish you luck. I want to start with what I really want to say. That's not particularly on this slide that you have in front of you, and then say that so that if in 15 minutes when my time runs out, I'll make sure that I've said what I want to say. And we're really in a situation where we did see these bad cuts that happened, but those did not happen in a lot of states. And the real question we've got now is, are they going to become a bad example, or are we going to head in a better example? And one thing I will say is, yes, bad things happen, but we really didn't have the widespread changes that we had in the 80s, where I believe it was 34 states, I think, passed negative legislation in the 1980s recessions. And so I just want to put it in a little bit of context. And we have a number of states that even, with the UI modernization, took some positive steps during the recession. So I think it's not a completely gloomy picture, and hopefully we can start moving things in the same kind of positive direction that they're trying in D.C. And so the message I want to say that I think we need to think about is, it's not really as effective to talk about unemployment as stimulating the economy or providing income support to jobless workers as it was during the recession. And that's for everyone here on this call. I see the names on my screen. I know many of you, and you're well aware that just being humane and just is not a sufficient policy rationale anymore. But I do really think that our message needs to be that people that are out of work want to work. And unemployment insurance fits into that. Unemployment insurance supports job search, and it improves the quality of the jobs people find. The jobs they find are better jobs, and they keep those jobs longer. And there's also good evidence from right in the heart of the recession from some studies in Nevada that show that actually giving people high-quality, in-person reemployment counseling helps them go back to work sooner, and they stay in those jobs longer, and it saves the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund dollars. Now, the opposite approach is the, we need to drug test everybody. We need to make everyone search for work 5 times a week. That to treat jobless people like they don't want to work. And that hopefully should be more difficult because so many people were unemployed during the recession. And even if people didn't lose a job, they have family members that lost jobs. And we should be able to expose the lies that people would rather, sit on their couches. Speaker Boehner put it a few months ago. So instead of income support and economic stimulus, I think we need to pivot to rapid reemployment, using UI as a way to get people back to work, and preventing people from falling into long-term unemployment, which even though the recession is over, we still have a record high level of people who are long-term unemployed. So this slide is talking about 2 major groups of people that are still left out. And those are part-time workers and people who have to quit for compelling family or other personal compelling reasons. And it's really, I don't need to tell most of the people that are on this call about this because I know many of you have concerned yourself. But, so we've done the study and it's in the toolkit, and basically there's still only 10 states that basically treat part-time workers on a non-discriminatory basis compared to how full-time workers are treated in terms of availability. 21 states do have, 20 states have some sort of part-time by past history. But 21 states still require that you be available for full-time work. And that's really not, it's just not defendable in today's economy. Employers have part-time jobs. They need workers to fill those jobs. They pay unemployment insurance taxes on their wages. And it's a practice that needs to end. And that's one area that we're encouraging people to look at in terms of deciding what your priorities are. The second group, which overlaps with the first group, are people, mostly women workers, but there's plenty of single fathers and other types of family arrangements that exist that didn't exist in the 50s when we set these rules up. But there's basically only 10 states that recognize compelling family circumstances of all sorts or compelling personal reasons of all sorts for leaving a job. In other states, people that are fired because they have caregiving responsibilities or other family responsibilities are disqualified. Now, these rules, if you look in the toolkit and you look at the sections on this, we show that the genesis of these programs was basically gendered assumptions that part-time workers were mostly married women. They didn't support their families. And, of course, need has nothing to do with unemployment eligibility, but nevertheless, the fact that they didn't need to support families was used to write these rules back in the 50s. And similarly, those gendered impacts come about when in most households, the women workers are the ones that bear the caregiving responsibilities and quit jobs for those reasons. And for that reason, those disqualifications fall more heavily on those workers, many of whom are also low-wage workers. This slide is basically because when you get the slides from the webinar, you will have handy links to all these resources that came out this year. Even though these are, to some degree, long-standing problems that NELP has been talking about for many years, we they're still, I mean, injustice is still an injustice. And so in February, we put out the Job Ahead, which is kind of an overview of our agenda on unemployment insurance and reemployment generally, both at the state and federal level. That's where we first called attention to the fact that last year UI recipiency reached record lows, and it will set another record this year, and we will call attention to that as well. In April, we put out a report with CLASP and the AARP about the special problems of caregiving, and you can get more details about what your state does in that report. We have maps, and it's a quick reference source. In August, we put out another report with CLASP, which is about how people that are subjected to volatile scheduling, which is kind of an emerging employment practice where people don't know how much they're going to work until just a few days beforehand, and how several UI rules don't really fit with that new employer practice and disadvantage claimants who basically lose jobs because they either get fired because they can't deal with the new schedules, or there's conflicts created with their family responsibilities and they quit. And then Ain't No Sunshine, I am sorry to say, is not a title that I came up with, but I always like to do clever titles. And this is a report we did about Florida, which is doing a terrible job. And it's maybe a kind of an example of how to attack a poorly performing state program if you happen to live in one of the bottom feeder states. So the toolkit is mostly what I'm here to talk about. It's really, in the past, I would say we had kind of a quick reference guide to UI policy. The new edition, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, is really a pretty comprehensive guide to the topics we cover. And the words reference guide, if you click on that, you will go to the toolkit. We have 18 separate sections that are all separately downloaded, so you do not have to read the whole sucker at the same time. And you can also, download it to use it as a resource as you may wish in different sections. This is just basically the table of contents. So, for example, on part-time eligibility and compelling family circumstances, if you look up there under Chapter 1, you'll see we have sections on those. They have references when I say this is based on gendered assumptions about the role of women workers. You can find references to reports from the President Kennedy's Commission on Women in 1963 or 4, basically saying these kind of rules should be done away with. And the main thing I want to talk about in my remaining time is really Chapter 4. It really turns out that Frances Perkins, who hopefully everyone here knows who she was, and the other founders of unemployment insurance were intuitively right about unemployment insurance. And that is, not only did they think that it would support the economy and help out the family economic security of individuals who are unemployed, but they believed that it would help people find work and support their job search. And fortunately for us, a lot of social scientists and even some economists have come to that conclusion more recently, And in Chapter 4, I really spent a lot more time than is really pleasant reading economics papers and providing you with and saving you dozens of hours of boring reading here. And the main thing I want to stress is that there are papers. For years, economists have looked and said, well, we can't really tell if you find a better job because of unemployment insurance. And well, it turns out, as you know, as economic tools have gotten more sophisticated and study design is becoming more sophisticated, that there are studies that do show that people find jobs and stay in those jobs, find better jobs and stay in those jobs longer if they have unemployment insurance than if they don't. There are also studies that show that people who have unemployment, don't experience poverty, don't experience mortality, have more positive, less negative health impacts and those kind of things. And those are assembled there in Chapter 4 and hopefully will be useful to you in your own debates in your states. So I want to just sum up by saying that I do feel that our ground is firmer under our feet as far as policy debates, that good things can happen. The little story that I have that I've been involved in is that today Illinois is repealing the Social Security offset for unemployment benefits, which many of you have known about in the past, in which in 2002 22 states had it, and today Illinois will become the last state to repeal that. And so I guess my lesson is that's 13 years of work, but those are positive things and definitely a small step toward justice, and hopefully with your guys' help we can take similar steps in the future. So I look forward to the questions and working with you next year.
Okay, thank you very much, Rick, for that presentation. We will now begin our question and answer period. If you haven't already done so, please type your questions in the question and answer box so that I may address them to the panel. We do have a few questions already in the box. This one is for you, Rick. We have a question from someone who works for the Center on Law and Social Policy, and they're asking a question about the family UI and family caregiving. They want to know if there are any successful outreach campaigns in general that could inform outreach and family caregiving issues.
So I guess what I would say is that that I'm not personally involved in any contact with caregiving groups that are working specifically on the UI issue at this point. And we have not been asked by any AARP groups subsequent to the report in April to get involved. I feel like those are allies that it would be very valuable to get involved in safety net issues, but we're not making that happen right now, to my knowledge.
Okay, and this next question is for you, Drake. You talked about there were some options that didn't make it into the legislation. Can you tell us, were there any other options that you considered, and how did you and the coalition decide which options to actually choose for your reform?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the coalition, we had a series of meetings essentially where we just hashed out the pros and cons of each of the options on the table with all of our stakeholders, considering them from the higher wage earner or the lower wage earner, how it would affect this community. And that's how we eventually got our proposals together, which we submitted to the Director of Legislation for the particular DC Council member who was our contact. That council member took most of our suggestions, but not all. So there were some things that fell off the table. I think I mentioned one of them already, which was to have a more generous wage replacement formula, either triggered by claimants who come in and have a base wage amount, which is less than a certain amount. Like we could do it by $15,000 a year or $12,000 a year, or less than that. But there just wasn't enough support from the council member to include that in the legislation. One idea we had toyed with, because we were concerned that employers would push back quite a bit about how a benefit increase would affect the trust fund, was we toyed a little bit with, well, would it make sense to change the tax formula for employers? Currently, DC has a pretty conservative formula where a tax increase is triggered very easily. And what it means is that our trust fund is generous right now. I mean, we're solvent. We have plenty of extra money at this time. That's great. But we felt that actually we had common ground with the employers in perhaps making it slightly less conservative so their taxes aren't increased so frequently, while simultaneously being able to get more support for the bill, to be able to pay out more in benefits, reduce the fund just a bit. Again, that wasn't really something that the council was interested in changing at this time. And when the council member introduced the bill, she actually said that her research indicated that our bill would not cause any tax increases for the employers at this time. So I think ultimately when we get to the hearing, that will probably be one of the biggest issues, and there may be more investigation needed and more research about exactly how the trust fund will be impacted or not. But those are two options that did not actually make it into the bill.
Okay, thanks for that. Rick, here's one for you. Do you have any data on the rates of UI receipt by race? This person says all the data that they've seen are from years ago.
This is a harder question to answer than you would think. But there is some race and gender information on UI claimants per se, and then you can get race and gender information about unemployed workers. But I agree that I have not seen anything recent. If whoever's asking the question contacts me after the call, there are a couple of studies that have been done in the last 2 or 3 years. There was a researcher who used to be at the Urban League that I could help connect you with, and but surprisingly, for example, we do not actually know how many people are on unemployment insurance benefits right now in the United States. We don't have an administrative count of that, and the race data is not as good as it used to be, because they put the race on the person applied in person, and the person that took the application put down the race. And now that people apply over the internet or by phone, they only supply that data if they want to, and so it's not as good. In the 90s, African Americans received benefits at a higher rate, a higher proportion than the composition of the unemployed. And the explanation for that at the time was many of them had manufacturing jobs. In general, manufacturing workers received benefits at higher rates than people in services and retail. And but I'm not sure that is still true. I'm not sure that's still true. So contact me after the call.
Okay. I just want to let folks know that there's still time for you to type in questions. So if you are holding on to that question, go ahead and type it in now. Another question for you, Rick. How many states are there that are still in debt, and how does that affect the ability to kind of grow these green shoots that we're talking about?
Well, the number has fallen rapidly during 2015, and the somewhat tricky thing is that there were about 8 states that issued bonds in the private debt market to repay their trust funds. So if you look at the U.S. Department of Labor website, it would not show that Idaho, for example, is in debt because they repaid their trust fund debt to the U.S. Treasury, but they have private bonds. But we're really down to, in terms of money that is counted in Bs, in other words, billions instead of millions, we're really down to about 4 or 5 states that still have some significant indebtedness. And the rest of the states are either, or at least back to zero, and some states are, quite healthy.
Okay.
Like DC.
Okay. Thanks for that, Rick. Okay, so last call on questions here. I don't see any other ones coming in. If no further questions, this concludes our webinar for today. We really appreciate your attention. We will be sending out to everyone who registered, we'll send out a thank you email. It'll contain a copy of the PowerPoint and a link to a recording of today's webinar. As always, if you have questions, you can email myself, Rebecca Dixon, the moderator. You can reach me at rdixon@nelp.org. And let me know if you need anything or if you thought of a question after the PowerPoint. Otherwise, thank you for your time and participation.
Thanks.